My name is Osman Balaban. I'm a professor at the Middle East Technical University, which is in the capital city of Turkey, Ankara. My background is on urban planning. I'm graduated from City and Regional Planning Department of the Middle East Technical University, and I'm also teaching there right now since 2012. I've been working in this department as an instructor. My research interests are on climate change and disaster recovery issues, but recently I'm more on the climate change dimension of it, and I try to understand the linkages between disaster management or climate problem and cities and city planning. I do teaching and I do research in the Middle East Technical University, City Planning, City and Regional Planning Department. The thing is, in terms of preparedness, the 1999 earthquakes, we were not very prepared. And there were some explanations or reasons behind that, because it was a total shock. The awareness on the earthquake and the disaster potential of Turkey among the general public were very limited at that time. Although there were some experts who are working on disaster management issues, who are specialized on earthquakes and so on and so forth. They knew about the fault lines in Turkey, and they knew that an upcoming earthquake, about some upcoming earthquake in that part of the North Anatolian fault. But this was limited to a research or academic community or expert community. But when you consider the general public, the ordinary people, or the people in different branches of the bureaucracy, public sector and private sector, and so on and so forth, the awareness was very low. And we were hearing that Turkey is an earthquake-prone country, and we had some previous experiences in the eastern part of Turkey, in the eastern part of this North Anatolian fault line. But people were not expecting that a really strong earthquake will hit the western part of Turkey. So that was a total shock. And as the general awareness was quite low, the country was not very prepared. The government was not very prepared, as far as I remember, and the research community was not very prepared, and the private sector and major actors, stakeholders of the community was not very prepared for that earthquake. But this time, the situation was different, and we had gone through a long way from 1999 earthquakes. And from 1999 to the previous earthquake, we also had some serious earthquakes in different parts of the country. One of them was in 2011 in Van city, which is in the far eastern part of Turkey. Therefore, this time, there was a general awareness on the bureaucracy, on the public sector, on the private sector, on NGOs, on universities, and even the general people. But despite this awareness, again, we were not very prepared. Unfortunately, the devastating results, the consequences, the impacts clearly indicate that we were not very prepared. But there were some attempts, initiatives for being prepared to this earthquake, because the research community and also the government, they knew that an earthquake would soon happen in that part of the South Anatolian fault in Turkey, and Kahramanmaraş was known as a potential epicenter. But what was not very well understood was that, because last time 2 strong earthquakes happened in a very short period of time. First, there was an earthquake, and like 12 hours later, a stronger earthquake also took place in the vicinity of the epicenter. This was not something very much expected, according to the scenarios that people were discussing. They were experiencing a strong earthquake, but 2 strong earthquakes in a very short period of time was something unexpected. But in a general sense, there was awareness, and we should have prepared. But that opportunity was unfortunately missed. In terms of impacts, there are also differences. This time, in the recent 2023 earthquake, the impact was quite huge in geographical terms. The disaster area is huge. And with these 2 strong earthquakes, one after each other, 11 provinces were impacted. were affected. And this is a huge regional geography in the southeastern part of Turkey. It's a huge area. So many cities were damaged. And the impact in terms of the number of settlements influenced, in terms of the coverage of the geographical coverage of the impact, this was huge. But in the 1999 earthquake, the geographical coverage was quite limited. There were 3 or 4 cities, maybe 2 or 3 cities, Kocaeli, Adapazarı, later on Düzce, Gölcük, small, Yalova, small cities, they were influenced. The geographical coverage was limited, but in that time, the economic impacts was huge because this happened in the western part of Turkey where many industrial activities were located. It's the industrial center of Turkey. Therefore, this time, the impact is huge in geographical terms, in number of cities influenced and so on and so forth, maybe the population. But that time, although the geographical coverage, maybe demographic coverage was limited, but economic impacts was huge because it was in the industrial location of the country and it was quite western part of Turkey. So in that sense, there are differences between the scope of the impact, but both of them were quite impactful earthquakes. And the recovery is also, I think last time in 1999, after 1999 earthquakes, recovery was quite quick and better because of the geographical coverage, limited geographical coverage but this time you have 11 provinces, huge geographical area. So this time the recovery is quite difficult than the previous one. Therefore, the recovery, according to what I remember, the recovery attempts were more successful in the previous one than today. The thing is, I'm not very positive on the answer to this question because this is not something very well known by people like us. Because there is no systematic, there is no planned recovery at the moment. There are things happening, like here and there are some recovery attempts. Some of them are, maybe most of them are taken care of by the central government. Local governments have been also responding to the situation. There are some NGOs, there are some different community groups who are part of the recovery attempts, but these are not kind of taking place within an overarching strategy of recovery strategy. That's a problem. That's a problem. Therefore, when you ask the scope and timeline of it, I don't have an answer. Because there's no overarching, comprehensive recovery, a systematic recovery strategy. That's a problem. So the scope, there are things happening here and there. Central government started with building temporary houses in safer but remote locations around cities which were affected by the earthquake, and then they moved to a different strategy, kind of declared that they would rebuild the cities within the central parts which were destroyed after the earthquakes. And now there are, for example, in Hatay, the part of the city center is trying to be built by some projects, micro-scale projects developed by some prominent architectural offices. In other cities, things happening, and people are kind of helping themselves. For example, those who has the capacity, they moved out to other cities and kind of continuing their life there. Whether or not they will return is not very known. Some other people, those who afford to build a kind of small house in rural parts of their hometowns, they did these sort of strategies. So there are different strategies of recovery, or attempts are ongoing, but they are not happening under an overarching systematic public recovery strategy. Therefore, the timeline and the scope of it is really difficult to answer. And my assessment, I'm not very positive and optimistic about the ongoing recovery strategy, because when things happening in an uncoordinated manner, without a kind of general plan and guidance, resources might be wasted. One effort might offset the output of another effort, and these sort of things happen. And without a general kind of guidance, you can address a problem in the short term by creating some other problems in the long term. For example, the negative environmental consequences of some permanent residence building or construction strategy, and so on and so forth. The thing is, TOKİ is an important public institution as the general housing administration of the central government. Until 2011, 2012, TOKİ from in early 2000s, in the, let's say, the first decade of the new millennium, TOKİ was a strong public actor in housing construction. That was the policy of the government of the time. TOKİ was the main actor of construction, housing construction in Turkish cities. But after 2011 and 2012, this role, this main role, is being played by the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change. The name was Ministry of Environment and Urbanization for a long time, but recently climate change was also attached to the name of this ministry. And TOKİ is working under the ministry since 2012. Therefore, the main actor from the side of the central government is the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization, and Climate Change. And TOKİ, as a part of, as a department or as a division, as a branch of the ministry, is now playing a kind of secondary roles in general urban development, housing construction, and so on and so forth in Turkey. But what's Turkey doing right now? To the best of my knowledge, as I mentioned, right after the earthquake, the central government, declared that they will start constructing permanent houses in safer but remote locations around the disaster cities. And they kind of search for safer locations in, highlands, in quite remote areas to the current city centers. And they launched this program and they started construction. TOKİ is now, as far as I'm concerned, TOKİ is now constructing these sort of permanent houses since the 2 or 3 months after the earthquakes happened. And these constructions are still ongoing. Some of them are finished. I don't know how many people have moved into those constructions, but maybe 10, 20, 12% of the actual need is kind of constructed by TOKİ in these locations. But there are criticisms. There are some adverse, let's say, consequences of these attempts, because these locations are safer. But when you look into some of them in detail, some of these permanent housing sites are in some critical ecological areas. They're in forests, meadows, some agricultural lands, and they're also quite remote to the existing cities and city centers. There are concerns about how people are going to be connected to the workplaces and to the service facilities and so on and so forth. So there are some adverse consequences of this permanent housing development, which is being taken care of by TOKİ in the recent time. But the coverage by these permanent housing construction of the actual housing need is still quite limited. But the main role, to the best of my knowledge, the main role which is played by the TOKİ is the construction of these permanent residences for disaster victims. But other than that, the main actor is the Ministry of Environment, Urbanization and Climate Change, not the TOKİ. Yeah, as I mentioned, as there is no planned, comprehensive and overarching recovery strategy, there is also a kind of selective, let's say, inclusion. I'm not very, again, positive on this transparency and also inclusiveness of the recovery attempts. Some university academics, some researchers are taking part in the ongoing recovery attempts. If they are done by the local governments, they get in touch with some experts, some universities, some NGOs, civil society actors. If it's taken care of by the central government, but this is not open to everyone, and there's a kind of selection, and you don't know how this selection is made, why these people are there, and there is no kind of transparency. The public, the general public, is not being informed in detail and on regular basis about what's going on in the disaster area in terms of recovery strategies. Therefore, inclusiveness and transparency is an issue, is a problem. And if you follow the public releases or opinion documents of some important NGOs or vocational chambers, like Chamber of City Planners, Chamber of Architects in Turkey, or there are some research groups who have been working on helping the recovery attempts. They're also complaining about the closed kind of nature of these ongoing recovery attempts. So there is an issue. There is an issue of participation. There is an issue of transparency, information sharing. But this doesn't mean that no universities are taking place. This doesn't mean that no academics, no experts, no researchers are taking. Some people are taking place. Some institutions are taking place. But there's a kind of it's happening in a kind of selective manner, and the reason of why some people are there and why some people are not there, the reason of why some institutions are there and why others are not there is not very clear. That's an issue, and a kind of a task force was established right after the earthquake happened under the name of Risk Kalkanı in Turkish, which is in English, if I literally translate it into English, it's like risk shield. Like the task force is kind of functioning as a shield to manage and minimize risks and so on and so forth. So this was led by the central government, but the group was composed of mainly academics and researchers from different fields of, let's say, risk management. There were academics from civil engineering departments. There were academics from or experts from geological sciences, city planners, architects, and so on. It was established, and the selection of the members was not very clear for the general public. That's not a big issue. It was a good attempt. It was a task force. But recently, I do not hear anything about what this task force doing since it was established. I mean, the information is not with us. And are they still active or not? It's still not clear to me. So this happened, but recently, even some basic or simple information about what this task force is doing and are they still active or what have they produced, for example, in the last 12 months, we don't know. For current reconstruction plans, we don't know if there are such plans. As I said, there's no general and comprehensive and overarching reconstruction strategy, and we don't have some plans, but there are some attempts, there are some initiatives, but how adequately, I'm not, again, very optimistic about the answer of this question. I haven't been to disaster area recently, but some friends have been there, and according to what I have talked to them, they said that there are, especially the low-income groups, the minorities, disadvantaged groups, let's say, they are still suffering and they are still in need of some basic needs. Some people are still in some bad quality temporary shelter areas, especially in terms of getting access to health services is still a problem. So, and these issues are still there. Right after the earthquake, advantaged groups, families, households, individuals, groups who have the capacity to solve their problems by their own resources, they kind of improve their situation. Some of them have moved to other cities. Some of them build or found new permanent residents in the area. Some moved to the rural parts, rural towns, and if they have a kind of piece of land, they build a house there. And the advantaged groups, the groups which have the capacity, they kind of improve their situations. But those who are really in need, low-income groups, unemployed people, people with disabilities, people with some chronic diseases, migrants, and they are still suffering from important problems and important issues, especially housing. Accommodation is a problem as far as I understood from the recent information. There are still bad quality temporary shelter areas in which mostly these disadvantaged people are located. When it comes to health services, there is still important problems, and some of these temporary shelter sites are prone to bad weather and climatic issues. And if there is heavy rain, if there is a flooding issue, if it's cold, if it's too hot, they're very much exposed to these sort of adverse events. So the problem, especially from the side, on the side of these disadvantaged groups, are still ongoing. Some improvements might have been made, but they are still in need of some basic services, basic amenities. Yes, that's correct. This part of Turkey is where the migrants, Syrian migrants, I don't know if it's correct to call them refugees because it has a kind of legal status. It refers to a legal status, and legally they're not refugees as far as I'm concerned, but Syrian migrants, especially migrants from Syria after the Syrian civil war, came to this area. So this region is home for millions of migrants. The demographic pattern is kind of changed because, as I mentioned in the previous questions, many locals, Turkish people or Turkish citizens, local people, who had the capacity to do so, left the region after the earthquake. They moved to other cities. Ankara, the capital city, has been a major target because Ankara is in the middle of Anatolia, and earthquake-wise, it's known to be safe because there are no strong active fault lines facing close by the city. Konya is a city which is southern part of Ankara. It's also known to be safe, and there are also some, Istanbul, although an upcoming earthquake is scheduled for Istanbul, but people also migrated to Istanbul. So among the local people who had the capacity to do so, they moved to other cities. They may turn back, but this is still something that we are not very much sure about, because if the recovery process extends, if it takes quite long, then people may not opt for turning back. Because when you move to another city after spending 2 or 3 years, maybe 4 or 5 years, you have a new life, and this new life may make things easier to return. Therefore, this is something that we don't know. But as many people have already moved to other cities, the share of the migrants in the total population, especially in some cities in the disaster region today, increased. For example, some people argue that in Hatay is one of the most affected cities in the earthquake area, and Hatay is the border town of Turkey with Syria. Therefore, it was also one of the hometowns for Syrian migrants. And some people argue that in Hatay, the population is now 50-50. Almost 50-50, because migrants, as they are among the most disadvantaged part of the community, of course, among them there are some wealthy people, high income groups, but they are quite few. Majority of them are low income people. They came to Turkey after leaving almost all their income or wealth in Syria. Therefore, they're among the most disadvantaged groups where they are located. Therefore, they couldn't afford to move to other cities. Therefore, most of them remained. But as the locals left, the share increased. And for Hatay, people say that it's like 50-50 or something. So the number, or not the number, but the share of immigrants in some of the affected cities or provinces increased. So this is a kind of demographic change. If the ones who left, those who left the cities, if they don't come back, if they don't return, then this means that the demographic pattern of these cities is going to change. And what we know is that the fertility rates among the Syrian migrants are way higher than the fertility rates of Turkish people. So this demography is going to change in the near future if these fertility rates are continue in the current, in line with the current trends. Is this important? This is important. Why this is important? Because another independent from this earthquake recovery issues, one of the most important or major social issues, social problems in Turkey right now is the increasing, I'm really sorry to say this, but unfortunately, is the increasing hostility against others, especially against migrants. Turkey has received a significant amount of migration, international migration recently, mostly from Syria, but recently we also received some migrants from Afghanistan and Pakistan. So many people came into the country in a very short period of time. And this is something for every nation. I think there's a capacity to digest these sort of demographic changes. And this was too large and too quick. Therefore, it was difficult for the country to digest. So there were some complaints, small, minor complaints. We were hearing them like 5, 6, or 7 years ago. But this issue is recently coupled with the economic crisis. Turkey is suffering from an economic crisis lately. Inflation rates are incredibly high. The prices are increasing. People are suffering from even satisfying their basic daily needs. The economic crisis is coupled with the economic crisis and also this earthquake and its related problems. So this increased the hostility against especially migrants and Syrian migrants. Recently, we are having some issues in, for example, in Kayseri. Right after a small issue that happened in the Syrian community, the local people, they attacked the neighborhoods that Syrians were living. They attacked their workplaces and so on and so forth. So there is this kind of danger which has already been accumulated. So this demographic trend, the increased share of Syrian migrants in the disaster region, let's say cities, is a problem, is an issue, is something that we should be concerned about because of this increased kind of hostility against migrants. And I am scared of facing some social conflicts, social problems encountering between different groups of the society. So, because as the share increases, the digestion and the saturation becomes more and more difficult. And people become more visible. And as they are more visible, those who are kind of waiting to be not welcoming may find, excuses to do some negative or unexpected things. I don't know if I could make my opinions here clear. You learn from every disaster or every unexpected thing. So we also learn. Turkey also learned, but the progress of learning here is quite slow. We do not learn as much as it should be and as fast as it should be. Therefore, there's a learning process ongoing, but this is, as far as I observe, this is quite slow and limited than it should be. The legislative improvements, some legislative changes, not very significant, not very substantial, not very widespread, but some legislative changes took place, but I don't know if we can call them improvements. Not in many respects. There might be some minor, changes here and there, but the most important issue was about urban regeneration or urban transformation policy in Turkey, because urban transformation is an important need in Turkish cities, because our cities are historical ones, and especially after or during the rapid urbanization processes of Turkish cities, we have constructed and developed a housing stock which is not in good quality in design or engineering terms, was improved, was constructed very quickly. So they're quite old now. And also we also had some informal settlements like slum areas, squatter areas, as a kind of consequence of this rapid urbanization process. So Turkish cities today are characterized by some safer and newer developed parts, but also by some areas, inner city areas, central areas, which need to be transformed, which need to be regenerated or redeveloped. So urban regeneration, urban development is an important issue of Turkish cities today. And since the initial years of the new millennium, some attempts or initiatives have been taken in order to develop an urban regeneration policy, urban regeneration legislation. But regeneration or transformation is really difficult to do in Turkey because of the property ownership pattern in Turkish cities, because the major residential form is apartment blocks. You have multi-story apartment blocks, and in these apartment blocks, people are kind of living in flats and condominiums. But in an apartment block, you can have an apartment block on a plot in the city. Let's say it's 6-story apartment stories and 4 dwelling units in one block, which means that 24 dwelling units, residential units, and each of them can be owned by different people. Even the ownership of one dwelling unit can belong to several people because of inheritance or because of some issues. So this is an important problem. When you approach to a building, residential building with 24 residential units, you approach to at least 24 different property owners. And in order to transform or redevelop or reconstruct that building, make it stronger, make it safer, or make it more resilient, you have to get the consent of all these property owners, and this is sometimes very difficult to do. This is often very difficult to do because people may have different expectations, and there is a building cost that needs to be covered. If you want to reflect a part of this cost to the property owner, say that I don't have money, instead of being indebted to have a new building, I can continue living in this existing building. And there are these sort of issues against urban regeneration in Turkey, and this cannot be always financed by public money, because Turkish government is not that capacitated in terms of monetary resources. And this is also, there are some equity issues, fairness issues behind it, because if you renew someone else's houses with the taxpayers' money, then why wouldn't you do it to other people? So there are some issues and problems. So urban regeneration is an important topic, but the legislation was quite not very well developed to overcome these issues. But right after the earthquakes, we again understood the importance of urban regeneration, and some changes, some legal improvements, let's say, have been made in the legislation concerning urban regeneration in order to speed up the regeneration process and in order to facilitate the negotiations between the public authorities and the property owners. Before, we were searching for a qualified majority to make a decision on whether or not be demolishing and constructing the building. There were some qualified majority requirements. Recently, it was decreased to a simple majority, and these sort of, in order to, if you cannot convince all people, but if you can convince, let's say 51%, then you can continue with the regeneration process. And these sort of improvements, in order to speed up the process, in order to facilitate the decision-making processes, have taken place with regard to urban regeneration. But to the best of my knowledge, there are still legal improvements to be made in different legislation of urban planning, urban development. They are not done yet. They are not touched upon yet, but hopefully, maybe in the near future, these sort of legal improvements can take place. But we learn from these negative issues, but the pace of our learning process and the scope of it is quite, according to my observations, are quite narrower than, let's say, expected. Yeah, this is something that I'm quite optimistic about. This is a question that I'm positive about. I'm very happy from the reactions that this urban planning and architecture communities responses to the earthquake. And especially people realized the urban planning and architecture, or let's say academic professions with regard to urban development. They realized the importance of their professional knowledge, and they realized the importance of their professions for disaster safety and resilience in the country. And they also realized our shortcomings in terms of the curriculum, in terms of the training at the universities, in terms of the expertise among the academics. These were, I think, very well understood. And there is now a good awareness on this. And some improvements, especially in developing new courses, in developing new training techniques to make the young professionals more aware, informed, and equipped about earthquake resilience and safety. Therefore, this experience is going to influence the professionalization and training of let's say, urban professions in the near future in positive ways. I'm quite positive on this issue. For example, right after the earthquake, we were at the beginning of the second term of the academic year in universities, and soon after the earthquake, in many departments of architecture and city planning, the instructors incorporated this issue, the earthquake disaster resilience issue, into their ongoing courses, and students were exposed to some comprehensive and important discussions around these topics. And also, I've been observing some curriculum changes, some kind of revisions in the conduct of some courses, the studio courses, the project courses, also some theoretical courses. So this is something. This question is something that I'm a bit positive about, and in the near future, I think that we will have young professionals in the field of urban planning and architecture who are better informed, who are better aware, informed, and equipped about resilience issues in cities.